Good morning, everyone. The committee will come to order. The chair reminds the committee that we are on H.R. 910, and the bill is open for amendment at any point. Keeping with the chair's announced policies, I will first recognize the sponsors of any bipartisan amendments. And before I do, I just want to make, I'm not quite ready to make, I'll reserve my comment for a little bit later. I would announce that we are going to break for lunch. This could be a long day. People may need some lunch. So we will break from 12 until 1 for lunch today. We'll adjourn for that hour. So with that announcement made, I just want to recognize the sponsors of any bipartisan amendments at this point. Are there any amendments of that nature? Not yet.
Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Mr. Waxman.
I have an amendment at the desk. Amendment number 1.
Clerk will read the title.
An amendment offered by Mr. Waxman.
And
I'd like the amendment read.
Without objection, the amendment will be read.
At the end of the bill, add the following new section, Section 4, Congressional Acceptance of the Scientific Findings of the Environmental Protection Agency. Congress accepts the scientific finding of the Environmental Protection Agency that warming of the climate system is unequivocal, as is now evident from observations of increases in global average air and ocean temperatures, widespread melting of snow and ice, and rising global average sea level.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Mr. Chairman and my colleagues, with this amendment, Congress accepts EPA's scientific finding that, quote, warming of the climate system is unequivocal, as it is now evident from observations of increases in global average air and ocean temperatures, widespread melting of snow and ice, and rising global average sea level, end quote. This finding is so obviously correct that there should be no need to offer this amendment. Here's what the National Academy of Sciences said about the reality of global warming last year. Quote, there are many indications, both direct and indirect, that the climate system is warming. The most fundamental of these are thermometer measurements, enough of which have been collected over both land and sea to estimate changes in global average surface temperature since the mid to late 19th century, end quote. Quote, other measurements of global temperature change come from satellites, weather balloons, and ships, buoys, and floats in the ocean. Quote, ocean heat content measurements, which are taken from the top several hundred meters of the world's oceans, show a warming trend over the past several decades that is similar to the atmospheric warming trend, end quote. Well, this is not the work of a single scientist. It's not the work even of some supposed cabal of climate change advocates. This is the work of multiple independent research teams using different analytical techniques and different data sources to arrive at the very same conclusion, that the world is warming. The National Academy also noted that decades of observed trends further provide evidence that the Earth is warming. They say heat waves have become longer and more extreme, cold snaps have become shorter and milder, northern hemisphere snow cover is decreasing, northern hemisphere sea ice is declining in both extent and average thickness, rivers and lakes are freezing later and thawing earlier, glaciers and ice caps are melting in many parts of the world, precipitation, ecosystems, and other environmental systems are changing in ways that are consistent with global warming. The National Academy concludes, quote, based on this diverse, carefully examined, and well understood body of evidence, scientists are virtually certain that the climate system is warming. I want to emphasize a couple of points. These conclusions are based on measured changes in the world we live in, not model projections. These are the conclusions of our own national academies, which include the National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Engineering, the Institute of Medicine, and the National Research Council. In the hearings last week on climate science that we requested, The Republicans' own witnesses acknowledge that global warming is occurring. The committee can vote down this amendment, but that won't help communities in Alaska that are sinking into the melting permafrost. The committee can vote down this amendment, but that won't help communities in the Southwest battling increasing bark beetle, drought, and forest fires. The committee can vote down this amendment, but that won't help Midwestern farmers whose crop yields are already being reduced by increasing temperature extremes. The committee can vote down this amendment, but that won't help communities along our coasts that are losing ground to accelerating sea level rise. The reality is, pretending problems aren't real doesn't make them go away. Most of us learned that in grade school. We need to face these scientific facts. I yield back my time and urge members to vote for this amendment.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair will recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in strong opposition to this amendment. The fact that my good friend from California offers it doesn't make it so. EPA has yet to do a real scientific analysis themselves of the issue of global warming. They're pretty good at reading press clippings and press reports. They're pretty good at funding scientists who have a conclusion that they try to make the facts fit, but I've yet to see them actually do a real scientific analysis on their own. My good friend from California tries to make it appear that the science is settled. I would actually say the contrary. The science is not settled, and the science is actually going the other way. There are just as many locations in the United States where the temperatures over the last 100 years have gone down, according to recorded temperature measurements taken, as they have gone up. There are just as many glaciers that are growing as are shrinking. The evidence appears that the Earth goes through cycles of warming and cooling about every 10,000 years. We have been in a warming period for the last 10,000 years, in fact, for the last 11,000 years. And so we may be actually going into a cooling period. There is one fact that my good friend from California did not put in the record, which actually is a fact, and that is that the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is going up. As best we can tell, around 1850, 1900, it was somewhere in the range of 300 parts per million, and it's now about between 380 and 390 parts per million. So that is a fact. Now, once you get beyond that, and to try to come up with these models, come up with some of these studies of tree rings and ice cores and things of that sort, it gets to put it as mildly as possible, it gets pretty murky. You know, we should not put the U.S. economy in a straitjacket because of a theory that hasn't been proven. And to put this amendment into the law, I think, would go against everything that people on both sides of the aisle say they're for. You know, I don't mind funding real science. I don't mind funding trying to find out exactly what's happening. But at one point in time, I spent a lot of time reading the IPCC reports and trying to determine just how valid some of this stuff was. And my recollection was that the strongest forcing agent, the strongest determinant of temperature are clouds, or cloud cover. And unless they have changed the models in the last year or so, and I'm not going to say that they haven't, because trying to model the cloud's behavior is so complicated, on that particular variable, which is the most important variable, they used a plug figure. In other words, they plugged into the model how much cloud coverage. They made an estimate, and they plugged it in. So the thing that seems to be the largest determinant in their own models, these scientific models, they didn't know how to model, So they kind of made a guess and put it in. Now, we know that if we adopted Mr. Waxman's and Mr. Markey's bill from the last Congress on CO2 reduction, that we'd have to reduce the amount of CO2 that we're emitting by man-made sources somewhere to, I think it was either 80 or 85% below I think the baseline was 2000. Now, to do that, we would have to go to CO2 emission levels that we last had in this country in the 1870s. Now, there's nobody alive in this room that was alive in the 1870s, but we were basically not emitting any CO2 except from coal plants and trains and things like that. So you can't do it. You can't get there. And so, with all due respect, this amendment, and I'm going to read it again, accepts the scientific finding of the EPA that warming of the climate system is unequivocal, is just flat not true. So, with due respect to my good friend from California, I strongly oppose this amendment and hope the committee will reject it. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Are there other members wishing to speak on the Waxman amendment? Gentlelady from Illinois is recognized. Ms. Schakowsky for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that the statement that we just heard, which is now in the permanent record and can be read by people from now on, will illustrate being on what it means to be on the wrong side of history and on the wrong side of science. This is not something concocted by the Environmental Protection Agency. In fact, this is the conclusion of all of the major scientific organizations and researchers in the world. I thought what I was going to hear from our chairman emeritus of the committee was regarding a hearing that we had when he was the chairman one summer when there was actually a red alert for the city of Washington where people shouldn't go outside and breathe, I guess. You're not supposed to run or exert, or children or adults shouldn't go out. And we heard testimony about the natural cycles. Now, if you notice in this amendment, it doesn't offer any kind of action. It just says, this is the science. And I think that it's very dangerous. This may go down, as Ranking Member Waxman said, it may go down, but it will not change the facts in this world. So while I think this is to get us to a baseline, can we agree on the science? Can we acknowledge as non-scientists, at least most of us, that there is a truth out there that has been researched? And even if there is some doubt about it, look at what's going on with the ice caps. Look what's going on in countries in our own country, states in our own country, and the kind of challenge. And I would say, on behalf of our children and our grandchildren, that it is time. It is getting to the point where it may be too late, where we have to wake up to what is happening, what we can observe with our own eyes, with what we can go around the world and in our own country and see. And that if we don't do it now, it may be too late. We will see all kinds of disasters, human disasters, that result from global warming. And it's very disappointing. I don't know what it would take for everyone just to take a look at the science that is there. I dispute what Mr. Barton has said, that there is not a consensus in the scientific community, and we ought to at least start from the same page. We may have different solutions how to address it, but let's pass this amendment so that we can begin to look at what we might do as a consequence of these facts. And I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair would recognize the gentleman from Florida for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd be glad to yield some of my time to Mr. Gingrich from Georgia or anyone else who would like to speak. But the fundamental fact is that Mr. Waxman is offering this, obviously to make a statement, but when he says Congress accepts the scientific findings of the EPA, he's really going totally against what we're trying to do today with the Energy Tax Prevention Act. Obviously, this is designed to stop the EPA from using the Clean Air Act to impose greenhouse gas regulations and to address climate change on their own. This is a congressional responsibility. Congress has spoken on this matter. The cap and trade passed out of this committee. It passed the House, but it failed in the Senate. It didn't go anywhere in the Senate. It's not law, yet the EPA is taking it on their own to go ahead and use the Clean Air Act to universally impose greenhouse gas regulation. And if Congress doesn't intervene with this bill we have today, the EPA's efforts to impose a cap and trade type of agenda, which Congress has not passed, will threaten to drive gas prices higher, increase utility rates, and send manufacturing jobs overseas and hamstring our economic recovery. I think we have a responsibility in this Energy and Commerce Committee to take it on our own to try and look at this and to prevent the EPA from stepping out on their own. And I think this bill is setting the groundwork for the EPA to say, okay, Congress has approved the scientific findings of the EPA agency, so now let's go ahead and regulate the greenhouse gases under that preposition. So, Mr. Chairman, I think is obviously a strong reason not to support this, but the fundamental fact that this sets a precedent for the EPA to go ahead. And with that, I yield to the gentleman from Georgia, such time as he may consume.
And I appreciate very much the gentleman from Florida yielding to me. I certainly concur with what he just said and with what the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton, said in regard to the Waxman Amendment. If I could make an analogy, I mean, this amendment, Congress accepting the scientific fact of the Environmental Protection Agency regarding global warming. If we were the Ways and Means Committee and we had a bill before us and someone wanted to proffer an amendment such that Congress accepts the scientific fact that cutting taxes for those who earn more than $200,000 a year always results in decreased revenue to the government. And it's the same type thing, and for that reason, I'm very much opposed to a statement like that being put in this bill. And I yield back to the gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair will recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Eshoo, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of the Waxman Amendment, and I want to express something that I think is really deeply troubling, and it is the following. If we keep moving into fact-free zones, it's going to be next to impossible for members of Congress from both sides of the aisle to come up with bipartisan solutions. If, in fact, and it is a fact, that the overwhelming majority of the scientists in our own country have stated that the emissions are dangerous, that it is affecting the very air that we breathe, the earth that we live on. This is not an ESC session. This does not discriminate. This will affect Republicans, Democrats, independents across our country and people around the world. Now, if you're going to treat science in the following way, where the overwhelming majority of scientists have stated what they've stated, with a very small percentage disagreeing, and give equal weight to those who disagree, then we're in trouble. We're in trouble in this country. And so it's stunning to hear my friend, Mr. Barton, say what he has said. we've worked together on a lot of things. So we can blah, blah about a lot of things around here. But when we attack the very results of the scientific community in our country and don't use that as a springboard for solutions, this is really troubling for our country. I think it's a slippery slope. I see it in other ways where, you know, I mean, what CBO came out with, and CBO for years, and both parties would say this, has been somewhat a thorn in their side because they didn't like the way they scored things. That's been thrown out the window. That's now been thrown out the window. We don't like CBO anymore. We're not going to pay any attention to them. The scientific community has weighed in. We don't agree with it. We're just throwing that out the window. But it is, again, I think, deeply unsettling, because if, in fact, we don't pay attention to the facts, which is the foundation for decision-making in the Congress, then ideology is going to prevail rather than science. Scientists, no matter where they go in the world, they speak the same language. They speak the same language. But I think that this is a warning signal. You can defeat the amendment, but what is more troubling to me is that we're moving out into a place where it is going to be next to impossible for the Congress to really start building solutions for the future of this country. And when we disable and cripple ourselves in that manner, we hurt our country and its future. So I think this is more of a warning signal than anything else, but it's deeply troubling to me that science would be, overwhelming science would be just disregarded and thrown in the trash bin. As Congresswoman Schakowsky said, we are really going to be lining up on the wrong side of history. And I don't think either party wants to be that way, and I think it's a regrettable day. I'd be glad to yield the remainder of my time to Congresswoman Capps.
Because I'll only add one sentence, which is that it's not just the science in this community. Our friends and allies across the world in developed countries where science is recognized as an authority have already moved past us. So we will be increasingly isolated in terms of the world connectivity. And as we all know, we have a global economy and we have a global scientific community. And I now yield back to my colleague from California.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A few centuries ago, when Galileo proposed a different way of viewing the world, he challenged the established scientific dogmas of the day to such a level that the politicians and churches of that day ostracized him and threatened him in many ways. Same thing happened in the challenges when Isaac Newton, confronted by Albert Einstein in ways of viewing gravity and challenging the scientific theories that have been accepted by so many as fact. We have to keep in mind that in science there are very few facts. There is an abundance of theories. And Congress voting on something that is science does not make it scientific. Congress voting on a theory does not make it fact. Doesn't make it so. It is Congress's job to review science. It is science's job to be scientific. Science demands careful, deliberate replication and review of studies. Science demands unbiased boards who look at journal articles and determine what has met the highest standards and what is worth publishing. Sometimes, and very often, scientific journals, panels of editors, also have their own biases, and that's why there are so many checks and balances within the system, and that's why so many articles have to be published and challenged and to see if they can be replicated. So science does demand this sort of replication, and for Congress to declare a scientific finding. It is the most unscientific thing that Congress could actually do. It closes the door to further research. It says we have reached a final endpoint in all scientific review. It says that everything that can be done has been done and there's nothing more that we should do. I think it is actually dangerous science for Congress to declare a scientific theory to be a fact. We recognize that there is a great deal of data out there about climate change. It will be a while before we even determine what is the climate impact upon the recent major earthquakes in Japan, which threw the planet Earth off of its axis by 4 inches and moved the island of Japan in some places by as much as 4 feet. We will find out over time what these things mean. But for Congress to somehow vote on this and say because many scientists have published studies along these lines that are therefore fact, it is absolutely unscientific.
Will the gentleman
yield? Dangerous ground for us to go into. And I would hope instead that we would review this as a scientific manner and remain open-minded to it. And yes, I would yield to my friend from California.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. The bill, the underlying bill, provides on page 4 that the following rules and actions are repealed and shall have no legal effect. And the first thing that's repealed is the endangerment and cause or contribute findings of the greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act, which was published in the Federal Register. So the bill is repealing the scientific finding of the EPA. Now, I'm not reinstating the whole action of the EPA. I'm simply having us agree to one part of that EPA action, which was that the state of the science at this point is clear that there is a warming of the planet.
Reclaiming my time, the bill does not say that the science is being changed. It challenges the ruling, keep my time, it challenges the ruling of EPA, which I know in our last hearing here with the administrative EPA, she acknowledged that, for example, in Pennsylvania, she was declaring jurisdiction and findings without ever talking with our Secretary of DEP. Let's refocus on gathering facts. I think this is where this Congress and this committee does its best work. We have much work to do. It is an important issue to discuss, and I hope we continue to discuss this because all of us want to get to the bottom of this and make sure we're protecting our air, our land, and our water. But I believe we should not be declaring science when so few of us on this panel or in Congress are ourselves.
Will the gentleman
scientists.
yield further?
Would
you yield further?
Briefly, but then I want...
I would submit that in the bill itself, there is a statement that the science finding of the EPA is repealed. If we are repealing science findings, we are doing exactly what you've said.
And reclaiming my time in closing, but that's because EPA declared a scientific finding, and I would challenge that EPA is not a scientific panel that has the authority nor the expertise to declare something a fact or not a fact. And with that, I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield 8 seconds to me?
I'll yield to Mr. Barton. Yes.
The EPA really didn't do a scientific analysis before they issued their endangerment finding. They rubber-stamped opinions that were already out in the public, including one press release that they quoted. They didn't really do an independent scientific analysis.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Markey is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. In 1632, the Inquisition put Galileo on trial for his belief that the sun did not revolve around the earth, but rather that the earth revolved around the sun. Cardinal Bellarmine ordered him not to hold or defend the idea that the earth moves and the sun stands still at center. Pope Urban VIII asked then Galileo to defend himself, and then he stood trial where he was found to have a vehemently suspect heresy. And then he was put under house arrest for the rest of his life until the Vatican finally issued an apology in 1991. The Catholic Church found him to be, his finding to be false and contrary to Scripture. Now, here we are, the United States Congress Energy and Commerce Committee, the committee which ignored the warnings of the National Academy of Sciences that the Yucca Mountain nuclear waste facility should not be built near an earthquake fault, that the permanent repository should not be placed near Yucca Mountain because it was near an earthquake fault. But this committee ignored it, notwithstanding the advice of the National Academy of Sciences that we should find a better location. And of course, we are free as a political body to ignore science. We have done it historically. There are many examples of it. But just remember this, we are not experts. We are congressional experts. And a congressional expert, when it comes to science, is an oxymoron. It's a contradiction in terms, like jumbo shrimp or Salt Lake City nightlife. I mean, there is no such thing. And so, yes, it is possible for us to repeal a scientific finding if we, as congressional experts on the Energy and Commerce Committee, determine that we want to. The Vatican did the same thing with regard to Galileo. He ordered the Galileo to abandon something that was false and contrary to Scripture. And I know that from the coal industry perspective, there is a Scripture, that there is still no evidence of a warming of the planet. But that is not true. There is an overwhelming consensus that has been reached that, in fact, just the opposite is the case, from the Arctic to the desertification of many parts of the world, including the sub-Sahara. There is massive evidence of a warming trend on the planet that is causing significant climate change. And so you're free, obviously, to if you have the votes, to repeal the finding in the same way the Vatican was able to repeal the findings of Galileo. But that does not make it scientifically accurate. So you're making a finding here. And you're making a finding not based upon any science. You're making a finding based upon a small slice, in most instances, of industry paid for research that questions the overwhelming consensus of scientists, not only in the United States, but on the planet. And you have the votes to do so. But it will not be a good day for this committee any more than that day when this committee selected Yucca Mountain, ignoring the science as the location, and then railed for years about why it is so difficult to dispose of nuclear waste. We should not be making these decisions here. We should respect science. And if we do, you will get the correct result from a policy perspective. But if you ignore it, which we can for a time, then ultimately we will reap the whirlwind. We're doing that now because we don't have a permanent location to dispose of nuclear waste, and then people who support nuclear power say, oh, all the nuclear opponents are really killing nuclear power. That is not so. If we had found a solid permanent repository, then the industry would be in a lot better shape. I think in the long run, our economy and the health of our planet would be in a lot better shape if the majority accepted the science here today. I urge an aye vote for the Waxman Amendment.
Gentleman's time has expired. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Gentleman from Louisiana.
I've listened to this debate. Very good debate. I accept Mr. Markey's frustration. I remember when the National Academy of Engineering said that there would be no appreciable benefit from instituting a blanket moratorium on all outer continental shelf drilling. It would not appreciably improve safety, that the causes of the Macondo spill were identifiable and correctable. We were frustrated. That scientific judgment was ignored, so it's still being ignored. But let's be clear. Although it was mentioned that the amendment does not mention the cause of the warming, it could be secular. It could be just a shift on the axis. Clearly, what is being sought for is a set of solutions that are embodied in last year's carbon trading system. Now, Again, I think Ms. Schakowsky said that no etiology was indicated, and then followed up by that was people talking about solutions. This amendment is trying to beg the fact that we should do a carbon trading system, which, as was discussed last year, would have minimal impact upon carbon levels, that would cause carbon leakage so that our energy-intensive enterprises would move overseas, taking with them American jobs. Now, if we want to say that it's hotter this year than last year, yeah, that'd be good, that'd be fine. But if you want to say, wait a second, because we find this to be the case, we're now looking for solutions, and those solutions involve a carbon trading system or something such as that, which is going to have negative or minimal effect upon global warming, as you define it, and have a tremendous impact upon American competitiveness and jobs, well, that's quite a different thing. So knowing that the basis of this is not quite so innocent in the sense of being neutral regarding job creation or job destruction, I would oppose the amendment, and sharing the frustration that sometimes science is ignored, because again, let's go back to the OCS drilling, but recognizing that this is merely a pretext, if you will, to set up a set of solutions that would themselves be quite questionable.
Will the gentleman yield?
I will.
To address Mr. Markey's concern here, remember in the mid-'70s when U.S. News and Report had on the cover of their magazine that we were in an epic period of global cooling, and they had New York City freezing, and all across the United States we were one glob of ice. Mr. Markey would use the same arguments back in the 70s for the global cooling that he's now using for the global warming. It's almost impossible to perform well-established procedures of laboratory science on the climate system. That's what they found back in the 70s. Nobody has done it, nobody can do it, and nobody will be able to do it. All climate models require assumptions, numerical averaging based upon experiments for which the modelers have to assume certain things. If so, why don't we have this global cooling that we were all so fervently scared about in the 70s, and all the magazines talked about it, yet it never occurred? And I yield back my time to the gentleman.
Gentleman yields back his time. Are there other members that wish to speak on the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No.
I call for a roll call vote.
Roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Barton? No. Mr. Barton, nay. Mr. Stearns? Mr. Stearns, nay. Mr. Whitfield? No. Mr. Whitfield, nay. Mr. Shimkus? No. Mr. Shimkus, nay. Mr. Pitts? No. Mr. Pitts, nay. Mrs. Bono Mack? Mr. Walden? Mr. Walden, nay. Mr. Terry? Mr. Terry, nay. Mr. Rogers? No. Mr. Rogers, no. Mrs. Myrick?
No.
Mrs. Myrick, nay. Mr. Sullivan? No. Mr. Sullivan, nay. Mr. Murphy? No. Mr. Murphy, nay. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, nay. Mrs. Blackburn? Mrs. Blackburn, nay. Mr. Bilbray? Mr. Bilbray, nay. Mr. Bass? Mr. Bass, nay. Mr. Gingrey? Mr. Gingrey, nay. Mr. Scalise? Mr. Scalise, nay. Mr. Latta? Mr. Latta, nay. Mrs. McMorris Rogers? Mrs. McMorris Rogers, nay. Mr. Harper? Mr. Harper, nay. Mr. Lance? Mr. Lance, nay. Mr. Cassidy? Mr. Cassidy, nay. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie, nay. Mr. Olson? Mr. Olson, nay. Mr. McKinley? Mr. McKinley, nay. Mr. Gardner? Mr. Gardner, nay. Mr. Pompeo? Mr. Pompeo, nay. Mr. Kinzinger? Mr. Kinzinger, nay. Mr. Griffith? Mr. Griffith, nay. Mr. Waxman?
Aye.
Mr. Waxman, aye. Mr. Dingle? Aye. Mr. Dingle, aye. Mr. Markey? Aye. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Towns? Aye. Mr. Towns, aye. Mr. Pallone? Mr. Rush? Aye. Mr. Rush, aye. Ms. Eshoo? Aye. Ms. Eshoo, aye. Mr. Engel? Mr. Green? Mr. Green, aye. Ms. DeGette? Ms. DeGette, aye. Mrs. Capps? Mrs. Capps, aye. Mr. Doyle? Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky, aye. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Gonzalez, aye. Mr. Inslee? Mr. Inslee, aye. Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Ross? Mr. Weiner? Mr. Matheson? Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Butterfield, aye. Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow, aye. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui, aye. Ms. Christensen? Ms. Christensen, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No. Votes no.
Chairman votes nay.
Are there other members wishing to vote? Ms. Bonomack?
Ms. Bonomack, nay.
Mr. Pallone?
Mr. Pallone, aye.
Other members on this side wishing to cast their vote? Democratic side? Mr. Ross?
Mr. Ross, aye.
Any other member wishing to vote? Mr. Matheson?
Mr. Matheson, aye.
Are there any other members? If not, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, 20 aye, 31 nay.
20 aye, 31 nay. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there other amendments at the desk? Or are there other amendments that members wish to offer?
Mr. Chairman.
Ms. DeGette.
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
Clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Ms. DeGette, which? Number 2? An amendment offered by Ms. DeGette.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is considered as read, and the gentlelady from Colorado is recognized for 5 minutes in support of her amendment.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this is another amendment following on the theme of the last amendment. What this amendment does is it says that Congress accepts the EPA's scientific finding that elevated concentrations of greenhouse gases resulting from anthropogenic emissions are, quote, the root source of recently observed climate change, end quote. In other words, not only is climate change occurring, but human activities are causing it. I know you'll want to accept this amendment by unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, so let me explain it a little bit. What the amendment does is it continues on the theme of giving the members of the committee what should be a very simple choice: voting to recognize the overwhelming science or voting to deny the overwhelming science. Now, following on the debate on the previous amendment, there was a lot of talk about what exactly is the science, and I guess my view and the view of many other people on this committee is that the EPA should base its rulings on science. Unfortunately, the bill itself instructs the EPA not to follow science when it says the administrator may not, under this act, promulgate any regulation concerning, take action relating to, or take into consideration the emission of a greenhouse gas to address climate change. So in other words, even if there was enough evidence to satisfy my colleagues on the other side of the aisle that there was science-based, a scientific basis for climate change, even then the EPA administrator could not consider this. It would be a barrier. And that seems to be not only a denial of science, but something that could be very, very dangerous as we move forward in trying to protect our planet. Last year, the National Academy of Sciences spoke definitively about the human contribution to climate change. First of all, they discussed the greenhouse effect. Greenhouse gases in the atmosphere trap the sun's heat near the Earth's surface, keeping it much warmer than it otherwise would be. The National Academy then states, quote, the atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases have increased in the past 2 centuries as a result of human activities. The rising concentration of greenhouse gases is amplifying the natural greenhouse effect and causing the Earth's temperature to rise. This is basic physics, Mr. Chairman. Scientists have understood the greenhouse effect for more than 150 years. We have undisputed measurements of the levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which have been rising rapidly since the 1950s, and even Mr. Barton agrees with that statement that CO2 has increased. The National Academy states, quote, precise measurements of atmospheric composition at many sites around the world indicate that CO2 levels are increasing. We know this increase is largely the result of human activities because the chemical signature of the excess CO2 in the atmosphere can be linked to the composition of the CO2 in emissions from fossil fuel burning. The National Academy concludes, quote, global warming can be attributed to human activities. Many lines of evidence support the conclusion that most of the observed warming since the start of the 20th century, and especially the last several decades, can be attributed to human activities. And it goes on about the other types of reasons that could be there, and it rejects those. Now, Mr. Chairman, the National Academy is our nation's preeminent science body, and we call on it over and over again to resolve different science questions. And so it's been concluded by them that the global climate change is due to human activity. What's the problem here? Just last week, NASA, somebody else who we generally respect, their scientific opinion, said that the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets are melting is accelerating rapidly and raising the global sea level. What it says is that the melting of these ice sheets has become the dominant contributor to global sea rise much sooner than model forecasts have predicted. And what they're saying is that it could be 12.6 inches within the next few decades. Now, that is a very, very real problem. And if the EPA and other agencies are directed not to address those problems, then this is a terrible legacy that we leave not just for future generations, but we leave as we begin to look more and more at these extreme weather situations that we've seen so much in the last year. So I would urge my colleagues to support this amendment and to reject any kinds of fuzzy science, because I think we need to look really in a clear way at all of this. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Does the chair wish to hear the unanimous consent request for the amendment, or do you want the debate to continue? Okay. Chair would recognize the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Whitfield, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chairman Upton, and I'm glad we're having this debate today because we all have the utmost respect for each side of the aisle, and I know Diane DeGette and I serve on a number of caucuses together, and we all admire and respect each other. And having said that, I think her amendment actually is more difficult to accept than the former amendment because she specifically talks about the global warming caused by human activity. I'm not going to get into the discussion of the science other than I want to make one comment. The other day, Mr. Inslee came into the committee and he had a stack of books this tall about global warming. We could have had a stack of books about the cause of global warming this high where people disagreed. I even have an article that the preeminent scientist in France, Claude Allègre, is the most outspoken global warming skeptic today, particularly as the cause of global warming. But I'm not going to get into that because this legislation really was not designed. We're not questioning the science. I don't agree with Mr. Markey about a lot of things, but the last body that should be determining what the science would be should be the House of Representatives, probably. But our legislation simply states that the Clean Air Act is not the appropriate legislation to enact these types of regulations that EPA is doing. As a matter of fact, Congress on 3 separate occasions has said no to Congress to EPA regulating greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. One was the 1990 amendments of the Clean Air Act, in which an amendment was offered to regulate greenhouse gases. Congress said no. In 2000, And sixth, the U.S. Senate voted by 98-0, instructing President Clinton not to send up the Kyoto Protocol for ratification. And then last year, the Senate refused to take up the cap and trade bill. But more important than that, we can all disagree on the science or whatever, but let me just state, the endangerment finding that EPA issued in this case on their wanting to regulate greenhouse gases is in court right now. A lawsuit has been filed. The tailoring rule, in which they exempt all emissions except from stationary sources of 100,000 and above. That has now, a lawsuit is pending on the tailoring rule. And those matters are really up in the air. And I might also mention that the air quality person from EPA testified here in this room and said that if they had to regulate everything, if their tailoring rule was declared to be illegal, they would not have the manpower or the money to regulate greenhouse gases. They'd have to have 88,000 more permits. They'd have to spend $27 billion, just the enforcement agencies. So really what we're talking about today is what is the proper way to regulate greenhouse gases. And Lisa Jackson, the administrator who we all admire and respect, is moving so aggressively, not thinking about the consequences of jobs in America, the cost on people in America, the fact that it would make us less competitive in the global marketplace. So for us to be sitting around talking about the science, I think it's a strong argument to make on the other side. But the issue here is the Clean Air Act is not the appropriate way to regulate something like this. And if we are determined to do it, which this administration appears to be, we genuinely believe that our economy is going to be hurt. We're going to lose jobs, and more. We're going to be at less competitive advantage to China and India and other countries. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Waxman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I think my good friend from Kentucky made a good argument of why he doesn't want to see regulation. But it wasn't a very convincing article why he should reject this amendment. All this amendment does is recognize the science, recognize the reality. If you deny the reality, then you don't have to do anything to address it. It justifies your failure to figure out a way to deal with it. He said that they're trying to figure out the proper way to regulate greenhouse gases. They don't like the way EPA is regulating it. Well, you can disagree with how EPA acts, but you shouldn't argue, therefore, that we won't even consider the science. This is science denial. It's not worthy of this committee. When we're told that vaccines can prevent diseases, that's based on scientific findings. We don't say, well, we're going to wait till the scientific findings are so well established that nobody could possibly disagree with it. In fact, we accept it because they are well-established scientific findings. Congress finally got around to regulating tobacco, although there were deniers of the science in the tobacco area as well. NASA is going to send some people into space. Congress voted to do that. That's premised on the science that they can send a person into space. It can happen, and it has happened. We have at the Department of Agriculture doing scientific research on how to improve crop yields. And our agricultural policy is often based on those scientific findings. Now, if you don't like the way that it's going to be address it differently. But to say that you don't want the problem addressed, therefore you're going to vote to deny the science, is really quite a dramatic know-nothing approach. Last week we had a hearing on climate science at the request of committee Democrats. We heard from some of the nation's leading climate experts, and I'd like to highlight some of their testimony. In 2007, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change found that quote, most of the observed increase in global average temperatures since the mid-20th century is very likely due to the observed increase in anthropogenic greenhouse gas concentrations, end quote. Well, that's pretty much the DeGette proposal, that we put that into the findings of this bill. Dr. Richard Somerville was one of the lead authors of the IPCC report. He explained the depth and breadth of the scientific work supporting their conclusions. The physical science portion was written by 152 scientists based on the body of peer-reviewed research. It's about 1,000 pages long and took 3 years to write. There were 3 separate drafts, over 30,000 peer-review comments, and publicly available written responses to every review comment. This is transparent and authoritative science. Since 2007, the scientific evidence supporting the IPCC's conclusions has only grown stronger. As Dr. Somerville explained, recent research shows that by far the greatest part of the observed century-scale warming is due to human rather than natural factors. Dr. Christopher Field cited key conclusions of the U.S. Global Change Research Program. This is a coordinated climate change research program. It involves 13 federal departments and agencies, NASA, NOAA, the National Science Foundation, and the Defense Department. Global warming, they said, is unequivocal and primarily human-induced. Climate changes are underway in the United States and are projected to grow, and widespread climate-related impacts are occurring now and are expected to increase. Even the majority's own witnesses did not deny that human activities are contributing to climate change. Science is important. It isn't to be disregarded. It isn't to be repealed by a legislative bill. Gentleman from Louisiana complained that he didn't think the president followed the science, and therefore he's going to retaliate by not agreeing to the science when it comes to global climate change. The United States Congress represents widely divergent policy views, and that's appropriate. But I think most Americans expect their federal elected officials to have a basic grip on reality. And I urge my colleagues to acknowledge the science and support this amendment.
Gentleman's time has expired. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? The gentleman from California, Mr. Gilbert.
Mr. Chairman, I'd ask that we all get a grip on reality. Frankly, the term science has been invoked here. I think that I have colleagues on both sides of the aisle may have concerns about what they think the facts are about the climate change or global warming. But I do have to take exception to some members invoking science when it comes to diagnosing the disease or the problem, but deny science when it comes down to evaluating the proposed cure to the problem. And let me remind everyone here on both sides of the aisle, just because someone says they want to address the problem doesn't mean it is the answer to the problem. I would challenge anyone to tell me, and in fact the hearings we had reinforced it, that 17% reduction within the decade does not cure the problem that is being proposed as being the challenge. The cure that's being proposed by EPA does not solve the problem or even address it substantially. In fact, in hearing here, the question was asked to Ms. Jackson, what is the percentage of reduction that you're going to get with this $400 million investment in this strategy? And the EPA could not even give us a ballpark, even an idea of the reduction. So when you want to invoke science, my challenge to you is tell me, show me a scientist that says the proposal by the EPA will address the problem. It will solve the problem. We don't have to worry about the ice cap melting. We don't have to worry about these issues. I'll just tell you as somebody that really feels strongly about this issue, I am frustrated that there are those that deny the problem, but I'm more frustrated with those who want to take a high and mighty attitude about science and about the problem, but refuse to admit what it's going to take to avoid the problem. We're literally being passed a placebo by the EPA when it comes to climate change, and no one's brave enough to say that. And no one's brave enough to say that this city has not been willing to grapple with this issue. It's basically used it as a political opportunity rather than a scientific challenge. And I again challenge anyone, tell me which science and which scientists are willing to stand up and say that if we implement the EPA strategy, the climate change issue can be addressed, and we assure the American people that for the $400 million we're spending on this project, it will avoid the problems that all of us are talking about. And that's where the disconnect is. We got one side saying it's not a problem, the other side saying the world's coming to an end, it is a huge problem, but the side that says it's a problem is denying and avoiding the tough things that have to be talked about, because we don't want to admit it's so big that what is being proposed by the federal government doesn't address the issue at all, doesn't avoid the adverse impact.
Well,
so, Mr. Chairman, I really concerned that if you want to invoke science, then let's be upfront about that, that the EPA admitted last week that their strategy, they don't know if it's going to reduce it at all, and we know that if we do not reduce it, not only by percentage, but within time, we're arguing about something that is not going to be changed by our strategies. And let's be brave enough and talk about it. But don't talk about science about the problem and then totally deny the science and your own EPA director's admission that what is being proposed by this administration, by the federal government to address EPA's concerns about climate change, they can't even tell us a percentage of reduction. And I challenge anybody to think that EPA is going to reduce 17%, which a lot of science says is nowhere close to the level of reduction. So if you say it's a problem, let's talk about reducing it down the line. But I would yield back at this time, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yield to me. He still has a minute.
Go ahead, Mr. Waxman.
I want to be courageous enough to tell you that's not the amendment. The amendment is a scientific, acknowledging the scientific issue. You say that
Mr. Chairman, reclaiming my time.
If
the amendment implies that the bill before us has something to do with avoiding or not avoiding the climate change issue. And the fact is, the science tells us we're not even in that realm. We're not even talking about avoiding climate change. We're talking about doing certain strategies that are being done under the guise of addressing climate change.
And therefore, we'll do nothing.
No, the point is this: do not promise and spend $400 million of American tax dollars on a proposal that you know your scientists tell you will not solve the problem. And if you want to say the do nothing, the gentleman from California want to say let's not do nothing, let's not sell the American people an environmental placebo that promises great things but delivers nothing. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Other members wishing to speak? Gentleman would recognize the chair would recognize gentlelady from the Virgin Islands. And before she starts, we all welcome the gentlelady back. We've not had the opportunity to do so. We're glad that you're back on the committee, and I would remiss in also saying that when we welcome the other members, to the committee at their organizational meeting, we forgot to welcome the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Walden, who was on temporary leave and also came back to the committee. So would recognize the gentlelady from the Virgin Islands for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the very warm welcome. But I just wanted to begin by saying what I think our ranking member Waxman was beginning to say, is that a lot of the objections are not on what the amendment is on. They're about how to regulate the greenhouse gases. This amendment, like the last one, is about just simply accepting the science. When around 1997 or 1998, there was a report, and I'm trying to find the report, but I distinctly remember it saying that one of the biggest threats to public health, it was about threats to public health, one of the biggest threats to public health were legislative bodies. And I didn't understand at that time why they would say that. But as I'm listening to the debate today, I clearly understand why. We don't accept science that sometimes we commission and we pay for. We rely a lot on the National Academy of Sciences, and they have stated that there's a strong, credible body of evidence based on multiple lines of research documenting that climate, and this is a quote, that climate is changing and that these changes are in large part caused by human activities. This is agreed to by 18 of America's leading scientific societies. Scientists at the 13 federal agencies that make up the global Change Research Program have also reported that climate change, due primarily to human-induced emissions of heat-trapping gases, posing significant risk to the well-being of the American public. And if you had been at a town meeting in my home just a couple of weeks ago, you would hear people living in the industrial area talking about cancers and asthma and all of the things that are being caused in a community that has one of the highest greenhouse gas emissions per square mile. So I don't understand why there's so much objection to just accepting scientific findings. The EPA did not do the finding. They accepted the findings of scientists. And I'm in support of this amendment as I was in support of the last one, and I urge my colleagues to vote.
Yield?
Yes, I will yield.
Thank you. I just wanted to follow up on Mr. Bilbray's comment that even if you accept that global climate change is caused by human action, that's not necessarily the solution. I think that's probably true, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't accept the premise that is agreed to by all the scientific community, that climate change and increased CO2 are caused by human action. Instead, apparently what the majority intends to say is, well, even if this is caused by human action, we shouldn't allow the EPA to make the solution. So even if the proposed solution is not the right solution, this bill says we're not going to let the EPA find any solution. And that seems to be the wrong approach.
Would the gentlelady yield?
It's not my time, so I can't yield. And I would say that what we should do is acknowledge this widely recognized scientific fact that climate change is caused by human activity, and then we should move forward with our environmental regulators, the EPA, to come up with at least a beginning of a solution to that, which is what the EPA is attempting to do. I think it's the sensible thing to do, and it's the scientifically right thing to do. And with that, I'll yield back to the gentlelady
from the Virgin Islands yield to me.
Yes.
I just want to point out that when we tried to do something about this problem in the last Congress, the top Republican on the committee, Mr. Barton, said, I don't want to work with you to find a legislative solution to a problem I don't think exists. So we didn't have any bipartisan help. Now the EPA is trying to regulate and do something about it, and this bill would stop them, absolutely stop them. So if we don't legislate and we don't regulate, we will do nothing about the problem. But that's not an issue, because now the Republicans are saying there is no problem. This is the official science-denying position of the Republican Party. If we have health-based standards under the Clean Air Act as to what is the level of concentration of certain pollutants in the air that harm the health of people, those standards are established based on the science. We could disagree on how long it should take to achieve it, the different methods that would have to be employed, but to say that we don't even accept the idea that there is a health standard is similar to what we're doing here. And I just want to point out that distinction. Thank you for yielding.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Are the other members wishing? Dr. Burgess from Texas, recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I wasn't going to speak on this because I think we've heard enough, but I can't sit here and be called a science denier by the ranking member of the full committee. Now, the amendment in front of us says that the scientific evidence is compelling. The ranking member referenced his witness, Dr. Sunderville, who sat on the panel last week. I asked Dr. Sunderville, if the science is compelling, how come you haven't closed this deal with the American people? And he suggested that perhaps we just hadn't talked about it in a clear enough fashion on the scientific side. But let me leave you with another fact. Now, everyone understands that Republicans are uncomfortable with this, but what about the scientific community itself? And I'm not talking about the great unwashed out in America. I'm talking about the people that read Scientific American. This is a scientifically literate community, and Scientific American polled their readership, nearly 5,200 respondents. The consensus of over 81% of those respondents think that the International Panel on Climate Change is, quote, a corrupt organization prone to groupthink with a political agenda, close quote. 75% of those people, that scientifically literate community that reads Scientific American, who on this committee reads Scientific American regularly? Okay? 75% think climate change is caused by solar variation or natural processes versus 21% who think it's due to greenhouse gases from human activity. 65% of that scientifically literate group of respondents think we should do nothing about climate change since, quote, we are powerless to stop it, close quote. And the same percentage, 65%, think science should stay out of what is a political process. When asked how much would you be willing to pay to forestall the risk of catastrophic climate change, 76% of that scientifically literate community said nothing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back my time.
Gentleman yield? Would the gentleman yield before he yields back?
Yes, I'll be happy to yield to the Chairman Emeritus of
since
the full
Mr. The ranking member called me by name, first of all, he did quote me correctly. Let's let the record show that I don't think CO2 is a problem, and therefore I don't think it needs to be regulated, and I don't think the EPA needs to do anything about it. He's absolutely correct about that. Let me just give you a few little tidbits since Mr. Waxman talked about a health-based standard, for greenhouse gases. It is a fact that the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, the upper atmosphere, is a little less than 400 parts per million. We think that 150 years ago it was around 250 parts per million, so it's gone up a little over 100 parts per million in the last 150 years. So it has been elevated. That's a true statement. But if you were producing vegetables and plants commercially in a greenhouse, you would keep the CO2 level at 1,000 parts per million. At 1,000, which is 3 times what the level is right now. There is quite a bit of evidence that we have had CO2 concentrations on the Earth up to 8,000 parts per million. 8,000. We operate our nuclear submarines routinely at CO2 levels over 4,000 parts per million. So, if my friend from California wants to talk about a health-based standard for CO2, it's going to be orders of magnitude more than 350 or 380 parts per million. It could be 10,000, it could be 20,000. I don't know what it would be, but it wouldn't be 380 parts per million. We can talk about all the emails where the scientific community, the IPCC, talks about using tricks to confuse the public. We can talk about the fact that many of the data sets that are used in these models have never been made publicly available for the skeptics to take a look at. You know, we're not opposed on this side of the aisle to real science, but we are opposed to pseudoscience that, if you implement it, puts the American economy in a straitjacket that costs millions and millions of jobs. So with that, I yield back to my good friend from Texas, Dr. Bird.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, I'll be happy to yield.
I want to just follow up, Mr. Barton. In today's atmosphere, there's about 380 parts per million of CO2, correct?
That's
and
correct.
And you're saying in a nuclear submarine, it's around 4,000.
It's allowed to be up to 4,000.
Right. And I did read a document recently that up to 5,000 parts per million, people were able to even withstand that. So I think you're making a good point, and I yield back the balance of my time to the gentleman.
Someone yields back his time. Are there other members seeking to speak on this amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
If not,
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I've listened to this debate fairly intensely and with much interest, and I'm really kind of astounded at the conclusions that the members of the majority have made. And I guess I'm trying to put this into some kind of a defining it in a way that that makes sense. And it seems to me we have 2 branches of scientists here. at odds one with another. We've got two scientific communities at odds with one another. We've got environmental scientists, and I think that outside is basically saying that the environmental scientists, the scientists who testified before the subcommittee, really at our urging and our almost at our demand, that they reached one conclusion. And so the environmental scientists are here competing and clashing with the political scientists that are represented by those of us who are sitting on this full committee. And so there is a clash between two branches of scientists. Since science is being thrown around quite extraordinarily today. And I've been told that when you have irresistible force meeting immovable object, you got a crash or collision. And I think that that's what's happening here today. Now, I know that you all will win this and you all will defeat this amendment. But as has been stated earlier, just because you have the political scientists who have gotten the votes and have gotten the power, don't erase and don't eliminate the facts that the environmental scientists overwhelmingly have, the conclusions that they have reached in regards to their study. We know that the actions of man, humankind, and we all believe that. The American public believe that. No matter what you do today, that's not going to change the opinions and the beliefs of the majority of the American public. No matter how you try to deny it, they believe and they know because it's been told to them by so many different respectable and so many experts that their actions are damaging the atmosphere, damaging the environment. And they know, high school students, grade school students, know that the preponderance of weather changes have to do with their actions and the actions of human beings. CO2, there are a number of other. They all know that. This is the truth of them. Now, you're arguing against the reality, but you're going to pass this, and we know you're going to pass this, but it won't change the beliefs of the American people, not one iota. And I think that I just want to say that, you can posture, the political scientists can posture as much and as proficient as they want to. But when it really gets down to it, the scientists who are experts in those areas, not the legislative scientists, but the environmental scientists, they're going to prevail. And they're going to prevail before the American people. And with that, I yield to the ranking member.
Thank you for yielding. I just wanted to make a comment on Mr. Barton's comment that people should grow their plants in greenhouses because of the carbon emissions. Well, we're hearing that corn and wheat and soybeans are having a problem because of the increased temperatures. I don't think they particularly have those increased temperatures in a controlled greenhouse. I'm sort of taken aback by our doctor's statement that a peer review is really a question of voting by the subscribers to a magazine, not by peer review of other scientists. I just find this debate quite amazing, and I thank you for yielding.
You're back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Are there other members seeking time on the amendment? If not, we can vote on the amendment. I suspect you want a roll call.
Mr. Chairman, I'll ask for a roll call vote.
Yeah. So if there's no further discussion, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton, nay. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns, nay. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, nay. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts, nay. Mrs. Bono Mack. Mr. Walden. Mr. Terry. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, nay. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, nay. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, nay. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Bilbray, nay. Mr. Bass. Mr. Bass, nay. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, nay. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta, nay. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper, nay. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance, nay. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, nay. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie, nay. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson, nay. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley, nay. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner, nay. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo, nay. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger, nay. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith, nay. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman, aye. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle, aye. Mr. Markey. Mr. Towns. Mr. Towns, aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush, aye. Ms. Eshu. Ms. Eshu, aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette, aye. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky, aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee, aye. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, aye. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner, aye. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson, aye. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, aye. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow, aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, aye. Ms. Christensen. Ms. Christensen, aye. Mr. Upton.
No. Votes no.
Mr. Upton, nay.
Members wishing to vote. Mr. Walden.
Mr. Walden, nay.
Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Terry.
Mr. Shimkus, nay. Mr. Terry, nay.
Ms. Bonomack.
Ms. Bonomack, nay.
Ms. Myrick.
Mrs. Myrick, nay.
Ms. McMorris Rogers.
Ms. McMorris Rogers, nay.
Mr. Sullivan.
Mr. Sullivan, nay.
Mr. Markey.
Mr. Markey, aye.
Mr. Pallone.
Mr. Pallone, aye.
Are there other members wishing to cast a vote on this amendment? Mr. Terry? How is Mr. Terry recorded?
Mr. Terry is recorded as nay.
Dr. Gingrey?
Dr. Gingrey, nay.
Are there any other members wishing to record their vote? If not, the clerk will report the title, or the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that there are 21 ayes, 30 nays.
21 ayes, 30 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there other members wishing to offer an amendment? The gentleman from Mr. Inslee, and the clerk will report the title.
Which one, Mr. Inslee?
The number, it's 3. Leans on section 4.
Didn't have your name on it.
Staff will disseminate the amendment.
An amendment offered by Mr. Inslee.
And the chair will announce that the amendment will be considered ask unanimous consent that the amendment be considered as read. Gentleman will be recognized for 5 minutes, and the chair will say that this will be the last amendment before we adjourn for an hour for lunch. So with that, Mr. Inslee, you're recognized.
Mr. Chair, could I ask the clerk read the amendment?
Yes, you can.
Thank you.
At the end of the bill, add the following new section, Section 4, Congressional Acceptance of the Scientific Findings of the Environmental Protection Agency. Congress accepts the scientific finding of the Environmental Protection Agency that the public health of current generations is endangered and that the threat to public health for both current and future generations will likely mount over time as greenhouse gases continue to accumulate in the atmosphere and result in ever greater rates of climate change.
Amendment is read. The gentleman from Washington is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It is 11:45 on March 15th, 2011, and at this moment we do not know whether or not the nuclear plants in Japan have melted down, but we do know that the Earth is in a state of impending meltdown. And we do know that the health effects for humans around the planet and in America over time will dwarf the damage that is so horrendous in Japan this morning. Never before have so many ignored a problem so large that endangers us so much. And it is appropriate to crib from Churchill in saying that. Because while England slept in the 30s, we are a nation that are sleeping today because of this war on science. And make no mistake about it, it is a war on science. Last week, one great party reduced funding for tsunami warning buoys. This week, they are reducing protection for human health. It is great timing, but most unfortunate. We can't simply whistle past this danger and count our sunspots. And I just want to say I've been trying to figure out why we have this war on science. Could I have the first slide, please, that I've asked to be put up? I want to refer to what we're facing, which is a huge increase in CO2. This shows where we are today, but look where we're headed. We are headed for, in this century, just stop on that slide, please. We're headed to a 200% increase in CO2. And everybody says CO2 is benign. Well, water is benign too, but not when it sweeps over you in a tidal wave. And we have a slow motion tidal wave of CO2, which will double in this century above pre-industrial levels. There is no peer-reviewed science in the world today, zero. And by the way, I've brought the collection of peer-reviewed science that supports the Republicans' position. It's right here on this desk. It's zero. There is zero peer-reviewed science that says this is not a problem. Now, how can one great party ignore this clear science? I've been thinking about this, and I think I have an answer. It's a matter of faith, and it's a lack of faith. It's not a lack of intelligence or a lack of reading science. It's a lack of faith. It's a lack in our faith to be able to skin this problem and solve this problem. I want to show you a couple slides. Next slide, please. This slide shows a picture of the dedication of the first electric charging station at a church in America. It was last October. I was lucky enough to be there at the Wooden Cross Lutheran Church in Woodinville, Washington. We have, and this is one slide of many, of how we can solve this problem. And the problem we face is one of the great parties does not have enough faith that we can solve this problem. Because they do not have that faith, they're whistling past the graveyard on this problem. I want to read the prayer that was issued by Pastor Woody Carlson on this event of this day, because I think it captured at heart what we ought to be doing here. Here's what he said. May God give his blessing to this charging station from end to end, from its foundation to its five-pronged plug. May all be welcome here, friend and stranger from near and far. May each be blessed and honored as they charge. May God's love be shared and peace between all people, even if there is a backup of people having to wait. Each day, every day, each plugging in and plugging out, the Lord bless you and keep you. Amen. Now that's the kind of faith that if we have, we can solve this problem. But ignoring a problem doesn't solve it. Next slide, please. Now, that was a small thing to do, but here's a picture of an I think it's an F-14, but I'm not sure. Maybe my military guys can help me. It is a picture of the Green Hornet. It is a United States plane that was the first jet fighter ever to fly on biofuels. It flew on a mixture of, I think it was camelina-produced biofuels on Earth Day this last year. This is the kind of faith that we need to have, and if we have this kind of faith, we will protect the Creator's creation, which is the earth. Now, we can spend hours here talking about the fact that the National Academy of Science and every single scientific community on the planet Earth has accepted the scientific conclusion in this regard. But I suggest, as a nation, it is more important to look up to that seal and look at the seal of the United States. It is an eagle. It is not an ostrich. The ostrich puts its head in the sand and it has its tail feathers in the air. And I think it's a time for us to start being a little more eagle and a little less ostrich, and let's pass this amendment. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. No. Request for a roll call. The clerk will read the roll.
Mr. Barton? Mr. Barton, nay. Mr. Stearns? Mr. Whitfield? Mr. Whitfield, nay. Mr. Shimkus? Mr. Shimkus, nay. Mr. Pitts? Mr. Pitts, nay. Mrs. Bono-Mack? Mrs. Bono-Mack, nay. Mr. Walden? Mr. Walden, nay. Mr. Terry? Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, nay. Mrs. Myrick? Mrs. Myrick, nay. Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Sullivan, nay. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Burgess? Mrs. Blackburn? Mrs. Blackburn, nay. Mr. Bilbray? Mr. Bilbray, nay. Mr. Bass? Mr. Bass, nay. Mr. Gingrey? Mr. Scalise? Mr. Scalise, nay. Mr. Latta? Mr. Latta, nay. Mrs. McMorris Rogers? Mrs. McMorris Rogers, nay. Mr. Harper? Mr. Harper, nay. Mr. Lance? Mr. Lance, nay. Mr. Cassidy? Mr. Cassidy, nay. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie, nay. Mr. Olson? Mr. Olson, nay. Mr. McKinley? Mr. McKinley, nay. Mr. Gardner? Mr. Gardner, nay. Mr. Pompeo? Mr. Pompeo, nay. Mr. Kinzinger? Mr. Kinzinger, nay. Mr. Griffith? Mr. Griffith, nay. Mr. Waxman? Mr. Waxman, aye. Mr. Dingle? Mr. Dingle, aye. Mr. Markey? Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Towns? Mr. Towns, aye. Mr. Pallone? Mr. Rush? Mr. Rush, aye. Ms. Eshoo? Ms. Eshoo, aye. Mr. Engel? Mr. Green? Mr. Green, aye. Ms. DeGette? Ms. DeGette, aye. Mrs. Capps? Mrs. Capps, aye. Mr. Doyle? Mr. Doyle, aye. Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky, aye. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Inslee? Mr. Inslee, aye. Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross, aye. Mr. Weiner? Mr. Weiner, aye. Mr. Matheson? Mr. Matheson, aye. Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Butterfield, aye. Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow, aye. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui, aye. Ms. Christensen? Ms. Christensen, aye. Mr. Upton? Mr. Upton,
no.
nay.
Other members wishing to vote? Dr. Gingrey?
Dr. Gingrey, nay.
Mr. Terry?
Mr. Terry, nay.
Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Murphy?
Mr. Murphy, nay.
Mr. Stearns?
Mr. Stearns, nay.
Mr. Pallone?
Mr. Pallone, aye.
Dr. Burgess?
Dr. Burgess, nay.
Are there other members wishing to cast a vote that have not yet voted? If not, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, 21 aye, 31 nay.
21 aye, 31 nay. The amendment is not agreed to. At this point, we'll adjourn until precisely 1 o'clock. My sense is that we may be able to finish, perhaps, before votes are asked on the House floor at 1:45. So we come back promptly at 1, and we can get started. We'll go into recess for an hour.